Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Chareidi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. Welcome back, friends. Dr. Yechiel Reit brings a unique perspective to the conversation around modern Chareidism. As someone who recently authored a book, Applied Monotheism, the Chareidi Response to Modernity, and is also an IDF combat physician who has served multiple tours of reserve duty, Dr. Reit argues for a surprisingly elastic and exclusively ideological definition of the label Charedi. I found his thesis counterintuitive, given how closely we associate these admittedly arbitrary labels with cultural markers. He forced me to consider whether his central thesis, which you will hear him unpack in our episode, and you can read about in his book, sufficiently accounts for the essence of the Charedi identity, without diluting the term to a degree that renders it meaningless. Indeed, by the end of our discussion, I found myself considering whether Charedi could be interchangeable with several other monikers, and actually, why this even matters at all. Of course, intuitively we recognize that classifying ideas or movements actually helps us define their borders. No one patrols those borders, but exploring them does matter, even if fundamentally they are just stand-ins for particular ideas or conceptions. Those quickly translate into a deep sense of communal and personal identity. Which also made me wonder, who gets to decide who is in and who is out? Insiders? Outsiders? Those who consider themselves the former but are considered by others to be the latter? Or is membership simply an application of objective criteria, as Dr. Reit might argue? And so, I hope you will find yourself as stimulated as I was by my conversation with author and physician, Dr. Yechiel Reit. We are here with Dr. Yechiel Reit, the author of Applied Monotheism, the Chareidi Response to Modernity, which we will learn all about. Quite a interesting and thought-provoking title. How are you, Dr. Reit?
Baruch Hashem, I'm very well. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for coming on. And really excited to learn a little bit about your work. Before we do that, tell us a little bit about your own biography. Where are you from? Where are you now? And how'd you get there?
I grew up in the Northeast of the United States, Brooklyn. I went to Yeshiva Staten Island, so I lived in the dormitory there for a couple of years. And then after that, again in Brooklyn, and then went to learn in Eretz Yisrael for 2 years, and then came home, got married, came home to Brooklyn, so to speak, got married, lived in Brooklyn again for 3 years after I got married, and then I moved to Syracuse, where I went to medical school for 4 years, and then I moved to Kew Gardens in Queens, did my residency while I lived in Queens, and lived there for 2 years after my residency, and then in 2005, we moved to Eretz Yisrael, settled in Beit Shemesh, and that's where we've been living since 2005. So just about 20 years now. Actually, not just about, it's exactly 20 years, because we moved in August of 2005, and now it's August of 2025. So for the last 20 years, I've been living in Beit Shemesh. What's relevant...
One second, Dr. Reit, wait, you got time out for 1 second. I'm hearing a lot of crackling on your end. Any idea what that might be?
I have no idea. I'll try moving the phone a little bit and see if that doesn't improve things. How about now?
I think it's okay. Keep going.
Okay, so that's just a short, story of how I ended up in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Along the way, when I lived in Syracuse, there's a small from community there. At the time that I was there, which is like 1995 through 1999, there were probably less than 20 Orthodox families. There was one Orthodox shul, the majority of the people that were actually members of that Orthodox shul were not what we would not Shomer Shabbos. And so being in a place where there was, very few people with a Torah background, except for the rabbi of the shul and perhaps one or two other people in the community, there was nobody there who really, had a basic Jewish education, etc. So I started doing a little bit of teaching there, shurim, in fundamentals of Amunah, as well as medical halacha, because I was in medical school, so it sort of seemed the appropriate thing. And there were also several physicians in the community that were interested in that topic. I then, when I finished medical school, I maintained something of a relationship with the community there that went on for a number of years. And for many years, I was working in the United States, even though I was living in Israel. I would travel back and forth. And so I would try at least once a month to go to Syracuse for Shabbos, and the old group would get together and we'd learn together a little. It was 4 or 5 people, etc. But it was an opportunity to learn with people that had an outstanding secular education, very bright people, very well educated secularly, but had not had an opportunity to get a Jewish education. So it was sort of a different type of different than, let's say, learning in yeshiva. This would go on. Then I would, in my medical career, come across a number of academics that I formed a relationship with in medicine, outside of medicine, that as well had, an excellent secular education, but very little Jewish education. And I formed friendships and chavrusas with several of these people. This also went on when I moved to Israel. I ended up getting drafted into the army because of my age. I was put directly in the reserves, but I served a lot of time in the reserves. In this war, I've been in the army almost continuously for the entire war.
That's right. It's still. You won't say it's still, there's like a choppiness to it. Like it's like in and out, in and out. Do you have like a headphones or something you can plug in?
I don't, but I can try moving. I can try moving downstairs.
Closer to a router, maybe?
I
I don't hear you at all now.
just trying to get that. Do you start over again? Just because if the recording is poor. Yeah.
We are here with Dr. Yechiel Reit, a physician living in Israel, but as we will hear, not necessarily from Israel. Welcome, Dr. Reit. Tell us a little bit about where you are from and how you ended up sitting where you are today.
Okay, so I grew up in the northeast of the United States, went to pretty typical Litvish yeshivas. At the age of 18, I came to Eretz Yisrael to learn for 2 years under Moshe Shapiro. I then went back to the United States, continued learning, but also going to college at night. And then about the age of 24, I got married and was living in Brooklyn, had 2 children. And 3 years after getting married, I realized I needed to do something more for Parnassa and decided to go to medical school. It was just about the time that I finished getting a Bachelor of Science degree from my going to college at night. So it worked out well. I ended up going to medical school in Upstate Medical College in Syracuse, New York. We were there for 4 years, from 1995 through 1999. Very small Jewish community there. At the time that I was there, probably less than 20 families that were Shomer Shabbos. So one of the things that I started doing during the 4 years that I was there was learning with people, because outside of the rabbi of the shul and maybe one or two other people in the community, there wasn't anybody who really had a strong background in Torah learning. These were people who, for the most part, had very extensive secular educations, typically a doctorate in some subject or another, and also the people who would come to be interested in learning Torah were also generally people who were interested in things, in ideas at large. So these were people who had often read quite broadly in terms of philosophy and other types of things like that, but they never really had an opportunity for a proper Jewish education. And so I was sort of, for many of them, the first opportunity. Again, the rabbi of the shul gave shurim and whatnot, but of this type that I was doing, I was probably the first person to do that in a long time in Syracuse. And it was very eye-opening for me, because it was not the type of learning that I had been doing in yeshiva. These people who were, come from a very different background, very different understanding of the world. After I finished medical school, we moved to Queens, lived there for 6 years. During those 6 years, I did my residency, as well as stayed on for 2 years after my residency. And then we moved in 2005, we moved to Eretz Yisrael, and we've been living in Beit Shemesh, Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph, since then, since 2005, so it's exactly 20 years now. While in Eretz Yisrael, I got drafted into the army and served in the reserves for a number of years in this most recent war, except I just got out of the reserves about a month ago. But except for 2 months in the middle, I've been continuously in the army since the beginning of the war. But, I've been in the reserves for more than 15 years now, 16, 17 years. I don't remember exactly, but a number of years. And, during that time, I interacted with a lot of secular Israelis who tend to be very different in terms of their world hashkafa than secular Americans. So it was also a different experience. I started learning with several people in that group, people who had, again, a very extensive secular education, were native Hebrew speakers, were familiar with Tanakh to a certain extent from elementary school and high school, but had never explored Tanakh from a Jewish perspective and had very little exposure to Jewish history from the Jewish perspective, as opposed to from the secular perspective. So it was also very different, a very different experience. And also people in academia that I had met along the way, who had a very different understanding of the world and what we would associate with the Litvish yeshivas that I grew up in. And so this experience led me to feel that there were certain ideas that were very basic and fundamental to understanding the Jewish worldview, but specifically, especially from an Israeli perspective, the Charedi worldview, that needed to be put out there in the world, so to speak. And over several years, I sort of formed a concept of what were the basic topics that needed to be covered, and I used that as a basis for the book. Once I was actually writing the book, I added a few other things as well, a few other topics as well. But basically, the book was based on my experience of learning with people that had a very extensive secular education, but a relatively limited Jewish education.
Excellent. So, and the book, of course, applied monotheism, which is the Chareidi Response to Modernity, which I want to get into. I just want to back up for a couple of minutes, because tell me a little bit about why you became a physician and what kind of doctor are you? What was, and how did that sort of inform or express your early way of thinking about the world?
That's actually a fascinating question. The second part, the first part is pretty straightforward. I did my residency in emergency medicine. Before I had gone to medical school, I had been a paramedic. So sort of when I started medical school, I knew that that's what I was interested in. and I had geared my entire career towards that. And that's what I've been practicing emergency medicine since I graduated from medical school. I guess 1 year I did an internship where I wasn't technically practicing emergency medicine, but other than that, I've been practicing emergency medicine since then. So we're talking since let's say 2000, about 25 years now. Um, that's the less interesting part, at least from my perspective. The more interesting part is how did the study of medicine or the study of biology in general, or the study of the principles of understanding science affect the way that I thought about a lot of other things. And I think that it has actually had a very real effect because, in my mind, science broadly understood and biology specifically forms the metaphors that I use to understand everything else in the world. So I do interpret ideas in a very, in other words, in science, things are very precisely measured. An idea is not meaningful unless it can be quantified. I mean, that's sort of what turns a hypothesis into a theory, is the ability to quantify it and show that it can actually work. That there's sometimes, an idea only becomes meaningful if you can find a mathematical way to express the idea, etc. And I think that type of thinking does very much influence the way I thought about things in general, and the way I understood philosophy in general and Jewish philosophy specifically. Um, so yeah, I think it's had a very, very strong influence on my thinking. I think that to a great extent, I don't know if I would have noticed it if I hadn't developed those metaphors on my own. But having developed those metaphors, I do notice that very many of the classical Mefarshim, particularly in Tanakh, have a very similar way of thinking. Uh, but I don't know if I would have noticed it if I hadn't developed that type of scientific discipline in my thinking. So I think it's had a meaningful effect.
And of course, you mentioned that you've been in the Army and the reserves for many years, which itself is interesting and perhaps a bit unusual um, in the community that you are residing. How did that come about when you first got to Israel? It sounds like it was pretty early in your, um, in your Aliyah story that that
Mm-hmm.
you joined the army. Did you ever serve full time, or was it directly into the reserves as a result of your age? And what made you decide that you were going to, I guess enlist in that way when there's certainly must have been avenues to, to not enlist.
Yeah, I definitely could have not enlisted based on my age and the number of children that I had. I definitely could have avoided enlisting if I had wanted to. I very much wanted to enlist. I've always found um, the military as an institution very fascinating. I think the psychology of militaries, the way people interact in militaries in general, in those types of organizations, and more specifically in combat. Um, I think tells a lot about the human condition. And I've always found that fascinating and always sort of wanted to be a firsthand observer of that. So, so I found it very attractive. And, uh, there are as well, if you want to call it, from reasons for doing it in the sense that it wouldn't be bittul zman because you're doing chesed. I mean, in the same way that you can do chesed as a physician by saving lives, you can do chesed in the army. It is a little bit trickier in the army because you're in an institution where your ability to do what you think is right is much more limited. It's so it's a drop tricky. It's not, one can't just put down a general chit that just says, you can do chesed by being in the army because you can save lives. It's not quite that simple, but certainly, but that is a consideration in being in the army, and specifically in being in medicine in the army. I have a little bit more freedom to do what I think is the right thing to do, not necessarily the institutional thing to do.
So have you been functioning as a combat medic? What's been your role there?
Yeah, you're a combat physician.
Which means what? You go out into the field with the troops, and if God forbid there are injuries, you're kind of the first line of response.
Yeah, that's basically a good description of what I do.
And does that mean going actually into the theater of battle with them, or does that mean kind of waiting back at a sort of a deployment post?
No, I go into the theater. I've been under fire numerous times.
Well, unbelievable. What's been your experience in the army as a observant and not just observant, but I guess Charedi or Charedi adjacent, whatever you want to call it, American Charedi individual, especially right now, there's a lot of vitriol towards that, part of the population. How have you been able to integrate with, your unit and other people that you encounter just more broadly?
So the unit that I'm assigned to is actually, in other words, the unit that I'm primarily associated with is Bogei Netzach Yehuda. In other words,
Interesting.
graduate of the Nacha Charedi. So it's uh, overwhelmingly religious, and obviously, from a religious perspective, it's very comfortable to be there. But I've done very extensive service in other areas, in places where on an entire base you couldn't find a minion for Shabbos. I've done that, for months at a time, and especially during this war. I spent 6 months in a commando unit that had very, very few religious people. Never had a minion for Shabbos. Forget about during the weekdays, but never had a minion on Shabbos even. Um, and it's a very different environment because I wasn't there for Shabbos all the time, but when you're there for Shabbos, you can be in an area where you're the only person keeping Shabbos. Um, and I'm not talking about keeping Shabbos like a proper ben yeshiva. No, because I explained to my children, if you're in the field, you have to really know your halacha well because every moment you have to be deciding. And when something's pikuach nefesh, you can sort of allow yourself to just do whatever you need to do and not have to think about it. But most of the time, it's not pikuach nefesh. And you're in an Arab village and you're thinking, is it considered a Carmelist or is it not considered a Carmelist? And if it's considered a Carmelist, can I only carry things in my pocket that are miftzai, that I actually need, or can I carry tissues in my pocket just because it's convenient for me to carry tissues in my pocket? And all of these kind of things that and much more. I once had to describe to Rav. I mean, we're going on a little bit of a tangent now, but since I got into it, uh, earlier in the war when things were very, very difficult in the northern Shomron, Jenin, in that area, Tulkarm, um, I was explaining to a Rav that, sometimes you can be in an armored vehicle for 36 hours straight. And I hope this won't be considered impolite to say on your podcast, but you're not going to go 36 hours without having to urinate. And sometimes longer than 36 hours. You could be 3, 4 days in an armored vehicle without any, except for when operational reasons, you can't leave the vehicle because you're more or less under fire the whole time and there's explosives all over the place. So it's dangerous to be out. So when you need to urinate, basically the driver will pull the vehicle up very close to a concrete wall, and then you can open the door. So you may be 20 centimeters from a concrete wall. You can open the door, and that's sort of considered safe because you have the vehicle on one side and the concrete wall on the other side, so snipers can't really hit you, and then you can urinate. And that's sort of what guys do. But and I have a question: is it on Shabbos? Is it better to stand in the vehicle and urinate out of the vehicle, or is it better to get out of the vehicle and urinate out of the vehicle? Because when you're in the vehicle is definitely considered Rosh Hashanah because it's more than 10 tvachim high and it's closed by walls and etc. So you're moving something from Rosh Hashanah to a Carmelis, or is it better to get anyway? I once was explained to my children that if you're going to be in the field, you want to
It's
keep
very
Shabbos
granular.
properly. right? Then you have to really know your halachas and know what you need, even the questions you need to be asking, or what you need to be thinking about, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about very often you can be on a base where people are not keeping Shabbos, and you're the only person keeping Shabbos, even in the most basic way. In other words, everybody's walking around smoking, talking on their telephone. I'm not talking about things that are mivtzei, that they're not things that are operationally related, because that there's a term for it. But I'm talking about things that are just downtime, and there's they didn't have a television, but they had like a big television screen that you could use to play like computer games, play soccer against each other, whatever. And that's blaring, and people are playing against each other on Shabbos afternoon when they have time off and whatever. And it's just because you're in an environment where the people you're with grew up in a place that they know about Kiddush Friday night, but they don't know that once you make Kiddush Friday night, that the rest of your 24 hours has changed. Then the rest of the 24 hours is just like any other day. And it's not their fault. This is sort of, the environment they were born into. But it makes it very difficult for the person who wants to be Shomer Shabbos and have a feeling of Shabbos, So for me, it was less of an issue because I'm a little bit older. I have a family, I have a wife, I have children, so I have sort of a strong anchor. And I also have a personality where I'm very open to new experiences. And so it doesn't bother me to do things that are not necessarily my comfort zone. I do a lot of things outside of my comfort zone. But you could think that, for a fellow who's 18 years old and doesn't have that anchor and maybe doesn't have that kind of personality, because the majority of people don't have that kind of personality, it's very difficult. And it has a big hashpah. And, if you do that for a year or 2 years, it becomes hard for you to keep Shabbos. It's not just a way. No one's forcing you. No one's saying, just because I'm smoking a cigarette, you have to smoke a cigarette. But it becomes difficult psychologically not to. I'm using the example of a cigarette just because it's actually a malacha d'oraisa, and playing with your phone is certainly not a d'oraisa, maybe not even d'rabbanan, whatever these surim are. It's much. But I'm saying, but even something as strong as a malacha d'oraisa, that when you came in, would be abhorrent, unheard of, who would do a malacha d'oraisa on Shabbos, and after being in an environment like that for 2 years, you lose a lot of that sensitivity, and it takes much, much more willpower to not do it, which is a risky situation for a person to put himself in. Anyway, that's not really what we wanted to discuss. So it just came up.
It's fascinating to me, and I'm just curious what the reception has been to your service. Within, let's say, more Charedi precincts. How common is what you've done? In the area that you live.
Where I live in Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph is a very mixed neighborhood. So you have Israeli Charedim, you have Israeli Dati Leumi, and then you have the majority, which is actually Anglos. And culturally, they don't really fit into any of those categories. Their children will. The children will grow up in Israel, and they'll be set off in one path or another, and they'll eventually fit in one of those communities. But the parents never will, which is actually true of immigrant populations around the world. It's not an unusual thing that the parents never actually learn the cultural subtleties of the new environment they move to. I think myself somewhat unusual in that respect, that I actually do appreciate the cultural subtleties, and I'm able to walk in different environments and speak to different people on their own terms. So when I'm in the army in Netzach, which the reserves is actually in many ways much, I'm using the wrong word, but I think you understand what I mean, much frummer than Netzach in the regular army, in the Sadir. I'm misusing the terminology. Yeah. Frum is probably the wrong word to use, but it's more culturally, right? But most of the very religious people that I'm with are Chardalnikim. They're Zionists. They believe that by serving in the army, it's actually a mitzvah. In other words, it's not a hechatimtza to do a different mitzvah, to do a mitzvah of chesed, of after l'reacha kamarech, or atzalas nefashos, or other things like that, which is the way I see it, because I don't really believe in Zionism. But to them, Zionism is an actual thing, and so they see serving the army as a mitzvah in its own right, not as a hachana for some other mitzvah. But I'm able to speak to them in their language, and I'm able to talk to them about the Torah of Rav Kook and whatever, because I feel comfortable there, even though it's not my beliefs necessarily, but it's something I can discuss in an intelligent manner. And it doesn't, I understand the cultural subtleties of that community, and I can walk in that community and sort of get it, so to speak. Um, but for most people, that's probably not true. Most of the Anglos that live in Ramat Beit Shemesh, the first generation, are are never really going to understand the cultural subtleties of any of the established dominant groups in the religious world in Eretz Yisrael. And then they send their children to an educational net and an educational environment that usually sets the children out in one path or another, and the children then will actually fit in, uh, and get it, so to speak, in that path.
So you would say that most of the people
Did that answer your question?
well, I'm kind of curious. Most of the people of your vintage, so to speak, didn't necessarily join the army and aren't having those experiences on a regular basis.
Well, that's true. That's true as well. I mean, part of it is I've had much broader experiences than most people in my neighborhood. That's correct. Um, it's also a personality thing that I'm open to that, and most people, like I said, have a comfort zone. I'm I have a comfort zone in certain things, but many things I'm certainly intellectual things. I'm very happy to move out of my comfort zone and explore other things. Um, and yeah, like I said, I've always had a fascination with militaries as institutions and with combat specifically about what it brings out in the human personality. And I I'm always sort of myself when in those situations, trying to observe myself and trying to observe those around me and trying to learn something about the human condition from it. That has nothing to do with my being Charedi or being Jewish even. It's just a personal fascination of mine.
Okay, so at some point you decided that you were gonna you did a lot of teaching, you did a lot of thinking, and you determined that you wanted to put pen to paper, or to use an anachronistic phrase, but you decided to put your ideas into some sort of organized organized work to present to the public. And you wrote a book, Applied Monotheism, the Chareidi Response to Modernity, which itself is then a fascinating, somewhat provocative title in a certain way, because why is that? What is uniquely Charedi about monotheism and so forth, which we'll get into. Um, but tell me about how that evolved. Where did this book come from to begin with? How does a nice, combat physician, American born, and living in Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph, come to write a book sort of defining the theological framework of the Charedi community, which is generally speaking, it is kind of an Israeli uh, reserved term.
Yeah, again, like I said, I very much fit into that community, though. Although it's unusual for Americans to actually get it, so to speak, as part of the Charedi community. You sort of dress the part and play the part, but you can tell the difference. Um, I actually, like I said, when I'm in the Chardal community, I understand their language, and when I'm in the Charedi community, I understand their language, and I'm able to have intelligent conversations with people that are thinkers in various communities, uh, because I have the ability to sort of get people, even if it's outside of necessarily my own cultural background or whatever. It's not anything. It doesn't make me smart or anything. It's just some people have a sense of humor, and some people have a sense of music, and some people have a sense of picking up cultures. And it's sort of something I guess I was born with. That's always interested me. And the main point is that I had Rabbeim who were who were masters of thought. And although specifically, I have several rabbeim that I could point to, but specifically, mostly I would to whatever limited extent I know how to think about these things. Yeah, I would give the credit to Moshe Shapiro. And although I was literally most of the time in most of the groups that I was involved with, the least of his students. In other words, I was sitting with people. I mean, I knew how to learn like any yeshiva bacher, but I was sitting with people that were Bekim and Shas at his shiurim, and and being allowed to ask questions, being, the small person that I am, because he went out of his way to be makar of me, even though I was literally in most of the environments that I interacted with him, I was not even as great as the least of the students.
Fascinating. So, how did the idea for the book come about? What was its sort of genesis?
So I took time thinking about this. A lot of like what you're talking about, what's going on now in the public sphere, relates to Chareidism as a cultural phenomenon and as the struggle, let's say, between various streams within Israel as being cultural struggles. And I think that that's a very unhealthy, unscientific way of looking at things. It's not that there isn't such a thing as Charedi culture. I mean, there are many Charedi cultures. Charedi world is very meguvan, as they say, very has a lot of stripes. I would say probably much more so than the secular world. In the secular world, it's much easier to peg people into three or four general categories, and it works. In the Charedi world, it doesn't. I mean, if you think about, let's say, Chabad, for instance, a typical, Chabad bacher, yeshiva bacher, 20-year-old Chabad yeshiva bacher, versus a 20-year-old Belzer yeshiva bacher. I don't think they literally, if you locked them in a room, they would find anything to talk about. Like they have nothing in common. And somewhere in between them would be a 20-year-old Litvish yeshiva bacher that probably has a few words to say to Chabad about the difference between the Nefesh HaChaim and the Tanya, and maybe a few words to say to the Belzer as well, but really is very different than either of them. And then if you took like, a Charedi Temani, which would be like the Temani that maintained the Temani tradition of, the way the Temanim felt and acted, etc., 100, 150 years ago, even 100 years ago. And you put him in the room, they would, again, it's a completely different world. And that's why there's like almost no intermarriage, right? I mean, how often do you see a Satmar Chassid marry even from another Hungarian Hasidus? But you don't see Satmar and Belz intermarrying, let alone, Satmar and Lakewood. And so they're very, very different groups with very, very different cultures where things mean very, very different things. I mean, you think about where I grew up, and probably I'm going to take a guess where you grew up as well, right? If someone would sit down at the table, at the Shabbos table, and eat with their hands, I'm not talking about a child, a 4-year-old, but an adult would sit down and start eating the kugel, the chicken, with their hands, we would look askance and we would think it very disrespectful. But this is the Shabbos table, even if you don't eat with your hands, specifically because it's the Shabbos table. But if you go to certain Hasidim, they would tell you what? You're going to allow silverware to come between you and the Shabbos food? Like that's how little you respect the Shabbos food? Of course you're going to eat Shabbos food with your hands. You want to touch it as much as possible. You want to be so these are like huge cultural differences. And then you say, well, so is Belz Charedi? I mean, they would be pretty offended if you said they weren't. Even Chabad would be offended if you said they weren't Charedi. Is Satmar Charedi? Is Lakewood Charedi? Is Mir Charedi? Is Rabbi Vadia Yosef Charedi? Are Temanim that are still in the tradition of 100 years ago Charedi? And all of these groups would say, absolutely, I am. To say, but you have nothing in common to the extent, like I said, that you wouldn't marry each other's. You wouldn't marry into each other's groups. So what makes you one cultural group? So there has to be something much more meaningful. If you're going to say that if you're going to say that the word Charedi actually means something, it can't be specifically about dress or about a particular attitude towards this or towards that. By the way, from my perspective, Chardalnikim are Charedi as well. And most Chardalnikim would agree with me. They consider themselves Charedi. I've actually had this discussion with Rabbonim in the Chardal community, and they're absolutely with Charedi. Whatever we think about Zionism and whatever, but we consider ourselves Charedi. So you say, well, but you dress very differently. So he said, I had this conversation with the Rav in the Chardal community, and he said to me, listen, in the Chardal community, we're more careful about tznius than in most other Charedi communities. So we're more Charedi than the other Charedim. But I said, but okay, that's true. It's true. But you're also dressing tznius, but very different style. Like
Culturally,
no one's
right?
going to mistake you. If somebody who comes from Mars might not pick up the subtle differences between the type of hat that on top of the shaitel that you wear in Bells versus, let's say, Satmar. That kind of thing they might not pick up. You have to be an insider to realize that. But they would pick up the difference between Satmar and Chardal pretty quickly. So you're dressing clear, but you're dressing very differently. So where does that come? How do you consider yourself part of the same group? So I say it's not a meaningful. If you think about it as a culture, you're missing the point. You're not thinking about it in a way that allows you to come to any meaningful truth. And this is an example of where you asked me, how does studying medicine or biology or science in general affect my thinking? This is a good example of it, where you need to have precise definitions for things. So if you want to give a definition to the word Charedi, then it has to be a definition that includes everybody who's Charedi, and any cultural definition that you give will not include everybody, probably won't even include most people. And yet they're all groups that you can't say, well, they're not really Charedi. I mean, no reasonable person would say the Mir is not really Charedi because the way I've defined Charedi in Satmar doesn't apply to the Mir. But that would be foolish.
Would
And so
separatism be a meaningful cultural marker?
if separatism was an ideal in its own right, that may be true. But I don't even think that that's true. Because if you went, let's say, to the Yekka community in Washington Heights, who are not really separatists in any meaningful way, um, they would say absolutely we're Charedi. And they'd be correct. It's not just, it wouldn't be a cultural appropriation. They're not trying to steal somebody else's name. They really are. And I don't think, let's say, the Torah of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, to the extent that it's still expressed in that community, is any less Charedi than the Torah of the Eastern European Rosh Hashivas like Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. I mean, they were different generations, obviously, but just as examples of people who are sort of dugmaot of certain Charedi ways of thinking. So, yeah, if you're going to define, if you want to have a definition of the word Charedi that's cultural, it has to be a definition that includes Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, includes the Satmar Rav, and includes Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. And it's pretty hard to come up with a cultural definition that includes all of them. And so that's why I think it's a much more scientific way to think about it, a much more useful way to think about it is to think about it as an ideology. And the ideology has cultural spin-offs. I mean, ideologies usually do, right? So if you have to take a non-religious example, right? You have the early Chalutzim who believe in being attached to the land of Israel and who believe in, because they were socialists, they don't believe in hired labor. So you have to, work the land yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So as a spin-off of that's an ideological statement, right? That's not a cultural statement. But as a spin-off of that, they had a particular way of dressing. Now, the particular way of dressing is a cultural marker, but it's a cultural marker that came from this ideology of I'm not a farm owner who hires farm labor. I'm a farmer, so I will dress like a farmer, even if I'm a wealthy, powerful politician, etc. But I will still dress like a farmer, right? So the dress is a cultural spin-off of the ideology.
Reminds me of
And that's sort of the
Zelensky
point that I make.
nowadays wearing battle fatigues all the time. Even when he comes
Yeah,
through with Trump.
yes. Yeah. So that's also a cultural spin-off of an ideology. Not necessarily an ideology, because I don't know it in the case of Zelensky, it might be defined slightly differently. But yes, but in other words, something other than culture has a spin-off that's reflected in the culture.
Fair enough. So I mean, it sounds like you're postulating, based on the title of the book, that in some way the concept of monotheism is this Charedi marker, which I think we need to define and understand, because obviously any, uh, let's say not a Chardalnik, who you're going to classify as a Charedi, and I guess that's in the name, Charedi Dati Lumi, but a regular Dati Lumi person, who considers themselves from Orthodox, might take immediate offense to the distinction between them as monotheists versus non-monotheists, if you're sort of relegating monotheism to the Charedi world. So, what do you mean by monotheism or applied monotheism, and how is it uniquely the province of those who would come under this grand tent of Chareidism?
Okay, that is an excellent point. That's basically what the thesis of the book is. So I'll try to describe the thesis of the book. The thesis is that monotheism, properly understood, the monotheism that Judaism talks about throughout Jewish history, the monotheism of Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, postulates that it's not simply that the all of reality has its source in a single creator. I mean, that's included, obviously, but it goes beyond that. And a classical example of this would be the Maharal explanation of the Pasuk V'yadata hayom v'ashavos el levavecha ki Hashem hu Elokim v'shamayim imal v'al haaretz mitachas ein od. The Maharal points out, and the Rambam, by the way, says something very similar on a different Pasuk environment, not that far away from there. But I'm just using the Maharal as an example. Like I'm saying, it's not unique to the Maharal in any way. He points out that once you say Bashamayim imal v'al haaretz mitachas, that there's no other Elohim acherim, right? So you've eliminated all the possibilities of Elohim acherim. What are you adding by saying ein od? And therefore, the Maharal says ein od is not referring to Elohim acherim. Ein od is referring to anything at all. And the point is then that when God created the world, He did not create the world in such a way that the world actually takes on its own existence. He created the world in such a way that it needs constant maintenance. The reality, existence, whatever you want to call it, needs constant maintenance. And that maintenance is the will of God. God wills it into being at all times. So in other words, it's not that, the classic, the metaphor for that is when a person has an idea, obviously, if he hadn't thought of the idea never would come into existence. But if he gives expression to the idea, then the idea becomes completely independent of him. Other people have the idea. The idea can be represented in artwork or in other physical forms. In other words, the idea now has an existence of its own. He can die, he can leave, he can change his mind about the idea. It doesn't make any difference. The idea has now been put out there, so to speak, and it exists on its own. So there is a model of creation where people think about creation in that way. In other words, God created reality, but having created reality, reality is real. It exists, it's self-justifying. It exists in its own right. And that model is not the model of Judaism. That's not the model. In other words, that's what the Maharal is pointing out, that the Pasuk is teaching us. Ein od doesn't mean that there isn't any other power. It means there isn't any other thing at all. There isn't anything that exists. Like I said, the Rambam says something very similar about another Pasuk in Dvarim, and there are many, many other examples of this, which is why Chazal call the statement Hashem Echad Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim. Right, that's the famous Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara talks about with the order of the parashas Krishma and says, why is this parasha first? Kadesh Kabbalah of Ol Malchus Shamayim first. So there's the words Ol Malchus and Shamayim don't appear anywhere in the entire parasha of Shema, right? So why is this Ol Malchus Shamayim? Because the point is that Chazal's understanding of the concept of Echad means that nothing else exists. If nothing else exists, then nothing else can serve as a motivation, as a machayev, as obligation, etc. The only thing that can obligate you is havaya. That's what it means, havaya achad. There's no other obligation. That's called Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim. And that's why, let's say, in the Malchiyos that we say in Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, likewise, Chazal used as one of the 10 Pesukim of Malchiyos, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Even though the word Melech, unlike all the other Pesukim of Malchiyos, the word Melech doesn't appear in that Pasuk. But the concept of Echad includes that God is the only source of reality, and therefore God is the only source of motivation, and God is the only source of obligation. Right? So that's one way of understanding monotheism. I would call that absolute monotheism, just for lack of a better term. There are other ways of perceiving of monotheism, and the famous example of that is Rachav in the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, where she explains to the spies after she protects them and helps hide them so that they won't be captured. she explains to them why she did that. She explains that she understands that they are going to win the war and they're going to capture the city of Yericho because she understands that their God, Havaya, right, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is Bashamayim Ma'al V'Al Mitachas. But she does not add the Ein Od. Because as a non-Jew, she doesn't have that conception of absolute monotheism. She has sort of, I guess you'd call it a conditional monotheism, or in the language of the Poskim, it's called Shituf, where there's monotheism, but there's also other things. The other things are not obviously other gods. They're not co-creators, but they are coexisting. In the perception of Chazal, that's called Shnei Rishuyos. And that's actually, the way polytheism evolved originally, which is that there were two theories among the polytheists: either that the existence is eternal, that it's kadmon, and there was no moment of creation, or that was probably a minority opinion. The majority opinion was that there was a Havaya, there was a creator God, who by definition was one, but he's not interested in the world. In the language of the Navi Yecheskel, Ozav Havaya Esaretz, Ozav Yud-Kei Vav-Kei Esaretz, he's not interested in the world. He's too great. He's got more important things, so to speak, than to worry about whether or not I eat lunch. So he put in charge of Marechet, Mazolos, whatever the various things that later became the polytheistic pantheon. He put them in charge of running the world. The way a great king doesn't actually decide, how parking should be set up in Beit Shemesh. He has a minister of roads who has an under minister of parking, who has an undersecretary of whatever, who has the local person. So you have the authority of the great king is expressed through a whole shalshelis, a whole chain of lesser authorities, but who themselves are making decisions. They actually have decision-making power, and therefore, if you want a good parking space in Beit Shemesh, you need to turn to them. And that's where polytheism comes from. And it also where paganism comes from, the idea of being able to make an idol, and that would be a talisman to express the God, means that the God is small enough, he's limited enough that there's something that can express him. He can be described. There can be an image that evokes the God. And that, again, nobody thinks that of the creator God, but they thought that of the lesser powers who actually run the world. Anyway, so this is not anything I'm saying. The Rambam says this, others say this, Chazal say this. But the point is, you cannot believe that that they are actually powers. You don't have to be an actual polytheist to accept the idea that, and in a modern way, we would say the same thing about the laws of nature. If somebody believes that the laws of nature, having been created, actually have power, they actually run the world, and they're not constant expressions of God's will for the world to run this way, then they're not an absolute monotheist. And that's sort of where the difference lies.
Okay, but wouldn't you concede that, certainly many medieval classical Rishonim in their approach to Hashkacha, sound more like that Chas v'Shalom polytheistic, but more like, this minimalist approach, right? That does allow for a type of a world set in motion, so to speak, at least for most people, right? Than this sort of more maximalist position of substantial or unceasing intervention in every person, in the minutiae of every person's lives.
So this is probably very far afield. Since you asked the question, I'm going to have to answer it, but it's probably very far afield of the subject, which was, we started talking about my book, and now we got off into Jewish philosophy. There's a pasuk that we say every day in Psukei de Zimra, right? Atahu Hashem, Ata Asisas Hashemayim, right? Ata Hashem Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? Havaya. Ata Asisas Hashemayim, Shmei Hashemayim, Haaretz v'chol asher aleh, Hayam v'chol asher bahem, v'ato machayeh et kulam, u'tzva Hashemayim l'chom mishtachavim. I hope I didn't miss any words there, but more or less something to that effect, right? So the sense of what we're saying is that you as Havaya created everything. We go through pirut of the different types of creation. Shemaim, Shmei Shemaim, these are different types of creation. Aretz is the physical world, right? V'chol asher aleha, Hayam v'chol asher bahem. The question why the Yam is different than the Aretz, why that's not included in Kol asher aleha. Different conversation. We'll just take for granted that that's the way it is for the sake of this conversation. Va'atom chayet kulam, which means it's not talking about living things. Atam chayet kulam means shamayim, shmei shamayim, haaretz, yamim. Those atam chayet kulam, that you are always giving them, always bringing them into existence. You're always animating them. I guess that would be the closest word in English. You're always animating, and therefore, utzva shamayim l'chom mishtachavim. In other words, all the things that become in the polytheistic pantheon smaller gods that actually run the world, they self-negate in front of you because you're vatamachayet kulam, because you're constantly bringing them in. If you would have given them independent existence, then the tzava shemayim would have an opinion. They would be somebody's. But because vatamachayet kulam, so tzava shemayim l'chom mishtachavim. Now that's a pasuk. The Navi said that, not me. So what you're sort of quoting is, let's say, the Rambam's. What the Rambam said. The Rambam was also familiar with the Nevi'im. He was also familiar with the pasuk, right? And he actually himself says similar things in various places. The Rambam. So the Rambam doesn't mean that there's some independent existence that, having been created, runs the world. What the Rambam means is the way most scientists today understand the way the world works. I'm talking about atheist scientists. We'll call them materialists. Are determinists, which means they believe that everything is cause and effect. And if you go back to that's the most fundamental principle of science, is that everything is cause and effect. So every effect has an at least theoretically, we may not know what it is, but theoretically has an a definable cause going back to the original cause. Okay. And then the original cause becomes some sort of singularity, and we can't talk about that from a scientific perspective. But they say, if you would have all the information that is contained in the original cause, you would know all of history, because everything is determined at that moment. Okay? So the Rambam talks about the difference between Hashgacha Pratis and Hashgacha Klolis. He's talking about the same thing, if I'm not mistaken, the Ramchal is talking about in the beginning of Das Tfunis, the second section of Das Tfunis. I could be mistaken about the location. Don't quote me on. I shouldn't quote myself on the question. But Ramchal says in that fullness, right? The Rambam means the same thing. Where the Hashgacha Klolis means that the Hashem wants the world to be a certain way. So Vatamachayet Kulam runs a world of natural order. So if Hashem wants 100 frogs in a particular lake, there's 101. One of them has to die. If there are only 99, a frog will be born. That Hashgacha Klolis, Hashem is running the world. And actually, that's not happening, according to the Rambam, that's not happening in real time. In other words, it's not happening at this moment when there are 99 or 101 frogs in the lake. It's happening at the moment of creation. At the moment of creation, God put into place a process that would guarantee that in our generation, in this particular lake, and this whatever, there'll be 100 frogs, because that's the world that God wants. Okay? Hashgacha Pratis is when God is responding to you. It's happening in real time. And when God is responding to you, then you have to be qualitatively different than a frog. Because if you're a frog, then you go back to the moment of Masa Bereshis and everything comes from there. So if you live your life as a frog, which means you're driven by your instincts and by your desire, your physical desires, and et cetera, that's how you live your life, then for all intents and purposes, you're a frog. You have the potential not to be a frog, but in reality, you are a frog. And therefore, your fate, so to speak, goes back to what was determined at the moment of creation. But if you live your life, what the Rambam calls the Tzaddik Gomer, which means a person who does everything only for the right reasons, so he's completely not a frog. He's the anti-frog. He's doing things only out of Bechira. So then he has Hashgacha Pratis, which means in real time, God is responding to him. And if a person's, let's say, 50-50, so he has 50-50 Hashgacha Pratis, whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is that frogs are, even though the Rambam says explicitly that frogs do not have Hashgacha Pratis, and everybody agrees with that, it doesn't mean that it's not V'atom Machayet Kulam. It just means that the Machayet Kulam took place in a realm which is outside the realm of Bechira. which is outside the realm of Hashgacha Pratis, outside the realm of Mida Keneged Mida. Because a frog is not born and a frog does not die because of anything that frog did. It's never a response to a mitzvah or an aveira, a good Mida or a bad Mida of the frog, because frogs having no bechira are neither good nor bad. They're always neutral. So whether you want to take the Rambam's position that that's all put in place at the moment of creation, or if you want to take maybe other Rishonim's position that that's also happening in real time, that's a fascinating machlokes to understand why they're disagreeing about that. What are the hashlachot? What are the nafkamina? That's all. But both of them are agreeing to what the Navi said. It's actually technically it's ksuvim. It's not the Navi, but close enough. Kulam. Okay, does that answer what you're making?
Yeah. So going back to your thesis of this book, and that this idea of, I guess again, call it like maximalist monotheism being a Charedi ideal. So where do you see that? Who would disagree with that? That would consider themselves an Orthodox Jew.
So what happened with the advent of modernity is that we could go through a lot of history. We could go back to the times of Tanakh and talk about the struggle between monotheism and polytheism, which is well documented in Tanakh, and the Nevi'im constantly calling upon Klal Yisrael to abandon the Avodah Zarah that they were learning from the surrounding nations. Shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. That same struggle then becomes the struggle versus Hellenism, which gives us Hanukkah, which Hellenism gets. They may or may not have been polytheists. Machlokes among the historians exactly how they understood the whole concept of gods, but it's not important for our purposes. They definitely were the original promoters of the idea of nature having some sort of independent existence. And so whether or not they were actually polytheists in terms of their avodah zarah is irrelevant. They believed in a world that did not express Vatam Achayet Kulam. And that led to a very famous war, for which we gave us Hanukkah today. And then you have the various other religions, which some broke away from Judaism, some came from other places, whatever, but that again are competing over fundamentally these issues. And then you get to modernity, which we'll define as the beginning of the Enlightenment in Europe, and that's why it's specifically a European phenomenon. It had very different effects on the Bnei Edot HaMizrach. And that's why Charedi as a phenomenon, until at least modern times, the last 100 years, was something that was associated with European Jewry. You have a rising among the non-Jews a concept which is very similar to the concepts of Hellenism, or was maybe a reawakening of the original Hellenism of the Greek philosophers of 2,500 years ago, where man, as the practitioner of rational reason, becomes the judge of reality and becomes what makes sense to man as a species, right, is true. And what doesn't make sense to man as a species is not true. And man is the arbiter, therefore, of what is reality. And that creates a very different set of values of what a person should be aspiring towards than had existed in the world up until then. And those values do not justify themselves as an expression of God's will. They justify themselves as having intrinsic value within the reality that we live in. They become the values that will later give birth to the values of atheists, who deny the idea that there can be any cosmic significance to anything you do, and yet they claim that there are still values, there is still such a thing as right and wrong. So those values then are independent of the Va'atam Achayet Kulam. They're independent of God's wills. Now, obviously, if a Jew becomes an atheist, then he's left Judaism and there's nothing to discuss anymore, right? But in terms of, you can't call him Orthodox anymore. But even if a Jew is still going to be Shem Shabbos, and if you ask him, why are you Shem Shabbos, he will say, because God commanded me to not do malacha on Shabbos. And I believe there is a God that is the creator, and I believe that he has the authority to tell me to mark his creation by not doing malacha on Shabbos etc. I accept that. That's a value. That's something that's important. It has cosmic significance, etc. But I also accept the fruits of man's reason. That creates values that are also important to me. So putting aside what do you do when those values conflict with each other, put that aside for a moment, even the fact that you have values that arise from somewhere other than V'atom Chayei et Kulam means that you are accepting that there are shtei reshiyot. There's God, and there's some other source of value, obligation, etc., etc. So now there are shtei reshiyot. And even though they wouldn't express it that way, in effect, that's what they're saying. And what we today call Charediism was actually the traditional monotheism. It's the same fight of the Naviim against the polytheism of the Ovdei Avodah Zarah. It's the same fight of the Maccabim against Greek philosophy being expressed in a new environment that says we have a new source for that can give meaning. In other words, that Hashem Echad is not really Kabbalah Somach Shemayim, because that's just one source of meaning, but you can have another source of meaning, which would be human reason, rationalism, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's a real struggle in certain parts of the Jewish world. There are many, many people who would say, yes, those values are values. I'll give you an example, okay, that I'm not sure if I give this example in the book or not, but it's a good example anyway. If someone feels that feminism, as not feminism of today, the DEI feminism, the feminism as it started out, the concept that men and women should be biological differences aside, biological differences should be left to biology, but in terms of sociology, in terms of society, men and women should be the same. Okay? So you say to somebody, is that a Torah ideal or is it not a Torah ideal? Now, there are people who might argue it's a Torah ideal. I don't think they can make that argument honestly, but they may say those words. In that case, we're having an argument over what the Torah says. It won't be the first time in history that two people had an argument over what the Torah says. It doesn't surprise me, shock me, or in any way disturb me. Okay, Judaism is full of arguments of how we understand what the Torah says. But a more honest person would say, he would concede to me the point that it's not a Torah ideal, that you cannot legitimately derive it from the Torah. So I would say, so then why is this important to you? Where does the importance of this, where does the sense of obligation, the sense of ought that you have towards feminism, where does that come from? Because it comes from someplace else. It comes from reason. It comes from a certain way, a certain value that I give to people as individuals. You have to ask where the value of individuality comes from as well then, but right, I have a certain way of thinking about people, a certain way of thinking about the world, and that gives rise to the ought, the obligation that I feel towards feminism. So, okay, so then you have two sources of ought, two sources of obligation in the world. You have Hashem Echad, which gives you Shabbos and Tefillin and Mezuzah and all kinds of other important things, including Ben Adam L'Chaverei, V'ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha, L'Sam L'Adam Reacha, gives you a lot of oughts, right? But you have another source of ought, which is not derived from V'atom Chayei et Kulam. It's not an expression of God's will. It's an expression of the world as it exists independent of God. It's an expression of a world that has its own self-justification.
Wouldn't they argue that God is the one who implanted that reason within the individual?
Yes, they would. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Some people would. Some people would not. I don't think that that's an honest argument. But some people would make that argument. The problem with that argument is that in that case, there can never be a conflict between what arises from reason and what arises from the Torah. Because if God is expressing himself through reason, just as he's expressing himself through the Torah, by definition, monotheism posits that God can't have two wills. There can't be two contradictory wills. So then reason would always have to coincide with the Torah. Now, if that were true, and there may be people who believe that that's true, then that's fine. Then I may not accept that. I may not believe that. I may not accept that truth, but I don't think that truth in any way conflicts with monotheism. The problem is many people will agree that is not what the Torah says. That's not an honest expression of what the Torah says. So when God expresses himself through the Torah, he's not saying that. And so to argue that he is saying that through reason means that he's setting up two conflicting rules. That's a problem in monotheism.
So you're again describing a sort of an intellectual uh, or ideological uh, expression or explanation of what Chareidism is. I think most people, at least that I've read, would describe Chareidism more culturally, like we started out earlier, or in a certain way as an anti-culture, meaning that it is the modern response as a retreat from a threatening alien culture. Do you disagree with that thesis, or do you believe that that is true, but this is the sort of the intellectual ballast for that?
Well, so first of all, I said it's not universally true because there are many people who define themselves as Charedi who have not retreated from the culture, and
Right.
that's certainly
But
the
you would certainly agree
entire.
it's overwhelmingly does describe
I don't
the
know. I don't know that it's important. I guess this might be another example of me trying to think scientifically. I don't think overwhelmingly matters at all because how many exceptions do you have to find to a law of science to prove that it's not a law of science? The answer is one,
right.
right? And so, in other words, if something is true the overwhelming majority of the time, but it's not true one time, not a mistake, but it truly is not true one time, it's not a law of science. So, even if I could find just one, but there's many, many more than just one exception to the idea that Charedi. So a tactic of Charediism is to withdraw, and then you have to ask yourself, then why is the culture threatening? Why was the culture of 1,000 years ago not threatening, right? So that Ibn Ezra and the Gaonim and the Rishonim that came shortly after them did not all had, not all, depends where they came from. The Bali cases maybe were a little bit different, but certainly in Spain and Italy and the Middle East all had extensive secular educations. So it was not threatening. And 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 today it is threatening. What changed? Why is it threatening? If you say, well, it's threatening just because they in the old days they didn't wear denim jeans and now they wear denim jeans and we find that threatening, that's a silly answer. That doesn't really explain anything. So you have to say what changed in the culture that makes it threatening. And I think that the answer will again lie in ideology.
Do you see this as a conscious process or as a just sort of a subconscious process or a process that evolves? Does the ideology is the ideology embedded within cultural responses, or is it a expressed reason, that drives the cultural process?
All right, so that's an excellent question. I think that the second one is the correct, historically correct. Obviously, the man on the street, okay, who probably would fall asleep within 2 minutes if you start to talk to him about philosophy, is not thinking that the reason why I'm wearing a shtreimel when I go to shul on Shabbos is because of some great ideological statement. He's doing it because my father wore a shtreimel. When I got married, they bought me a shtreimel. So I wear a shtreimel. I don't really know why. That's sort of what they do in my community. And if I wouldn't do it, then I wouldn't be part of the community. People would look at me strange. I would be an outcast, and I don't want to be an outcast. So I'm going to do what everybody else wears a shtreimel on Shabbos. I'm going to wear a shtreimel on Shabbos too. Okay. And I agree that the world is full of people. The majority of people in the world are those kind of people. You try to speak to them about philosophy, and they very quickly fall asleep, glaze over. If they're polite, they'll pretend that they're listening to you. If they're not polite, they'll just walk away, right? They have no interest. They don't want to think about these things. That's fine. But if you're talking about the fathers, the people who created what we would call Chareidism, if you're talking about the Vilna Gaon or the Noda B'Yehuda or the Chassam
Or some
Sofer
cipher.
or in
Yeah.
modern day, right? No, but it doesn't go back to the Chassam Sofer. It's much, or that's what I'm trying to say. Modern Chareidism is not the Chassam Sofer. That's a very specific schnit of modern Chareidism. If you go back to Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, if you go back to many other dugmaot like that, if you go back to the Netziv, they definitely were very aware of what they were doing, and they were motivated. They were motivated by an ideology, and they created the culture to promote the ideology.
Just in closing, Dr. Wright, tell us a little bit about maybe list a couple of more called nafkaminas, specific areas of ideology or of topics that this distinction would express itself, or you might have some that would self-identify as
Okay,
Orthodox
I can give you an
might think
example.
differently.
Okay, so I'll give you what to me is a classical example of this. I don't know. I don't know whether or not I mentioned it in my book. I think I was thinking of it and then I took it out because I didn't want to put in things that were too. I didn't want to put in things that were too emotional. Whatever. I'm not sure whether or not it's in the book, but it's a good example. And if he hears this podcast and he thinks I'm misrepresenting him, he's welcome to contact me. And if he convinces me that I misrepresented him, I will correct myself. There is a fellow named Stern who is currently a politician. He's a member of the Knesset in Israel. And before that, he was a general in the army. He was Rosh Aka, the head of the manpower directorate in the army, which has very important cultural hashlachot within the army, very important cultural consequences within the army. And earlier than that, he was a paratrooper and et cetera, et cetera. He probably did many heroic and meaningful things in his military career before he became Rosh Aka. Anyway, he wrote a book called Masa Kumta, which was sort of his biography up to the point where he wrote it. He wrote it, I think, 10, 15 years ago, something like that. So I assume some things have happened in his life since then, but it was the biography of his life up until that point. I'm sure you know the term, but just for English speakers who may not be familiar with the term, Masa Kumta is when you finish basic training, especially in the infantry, you do this extended walk for many, many kilometers, and then overnight, and then you arrive in the morning. Usually, it's not always exactly the same, but you arrive in the morning and you have a big graduation ceremony, and families come and watch, and cheer for you, and everything. And you switch from the basic green kumta that you got when you first came into the army to the specific kumta, the specific beret, the color design of the beret of your specific unit. Now you're officially a member of the unit. You finished basic training. Okay, it's a big thing in the army when you do your Masa Kumta. It's having arrived, so to speak, like literally and figuratively having arrived. And so that he named his biography Masa Kumta. The Chervet. I've arrived. This is what I accomplished and built over my life. Anyway, in there he tells a story where he was home for Shabbos. He had gotten off from the army when he was a commander in a combat unit, and he gets a phone call that there had been some sort of fight with terrorists, and one of his soldiers had gotten killed. Gets a phone call on Shabbos afternoon. Now, he knows the wife of this soldier. She lives in a community in his area of the country, but not within walking distance of where he is for Shabbos. And he knows that if he calls that community to tell her that her husband has been killed, no one will answer the phone because they're Sabbath observant people. They won't answer the phone on Shabbos. Also, we're talking about in a time in Israel when a lot of people didn't have telephones. So it may not have technically been possible to call her. So he's in his own mind describing how he's deciding what he should do. He feels psychologically it will be very bad for her. She's Shabbos afternoon. She's probably hanging out with her friends, and they're schmoozing and they're joking and having a good time. And Motzei Shabbos, someone's going to come to her yeshuv and tell her that her husband has been killed. And she's going to realize that at the time that her husband was killed and all afternoon while he was dead, she was busy joking and fooling around with her friends. And psychologically, that's going to be very unhealthy for her, that realization. So he wants her to find out as soon as possible. Not that there's anything she can do about it on Shabbos afternoon, but he feels it's important psychologically that she should find out as soon as possible. On the other hand, he has no way of contacting her except for to get into his car and drive to her yeshuv, which is obviously not just, it's malacha deraisa, he'd be violating Shabbos l'chol hadayos. Okay? So he describes his hitlaptut. He's going back and forth and he's trying to decide what the proper thing to do is. Now, maybe one could make an argument that her psychological health could have ashlachot that could be pikuach nefesh. Maybe she'll turn suicide. I don't know. Maybe one can make all kinds of arguments about what they would be concerned could happen. but that's and therefore try to find some way that al pi halacha it would be permitted to drive to tell her about this. But that's not the decision that he makes. He doesn't fool himself into thinking that it's permitted by halacha. He realizes that's prohibited by halacha, but he has an obligation towards the army, towards the state, as a as this person's commanding officer, as the representative of the state, towards the family of a soldier who was killed. He has an obligation to do what he thinks is best for her, which is to drive there on Shabbos. And so he presents it as he has these two competing obligations. In the end, he decides that he will drive there, and he does.
Is
And
he
whatever.
himself an Orthodox person?
Yeah, I mean, he's a person who wears a kippah and is nominally Shomer Shabbos. I mean, in this particular instance, he presents himself as violating Shabbos. So I don't know if you could really call him Shomer Shabbos, but when he doesn't think he has some compelling reason, again, I'm not talking about a halachically compelling reason.
I understand. Yeah.
But when he doesn't think he has a compelling reason to violate Shabbos, and just for the fun of it, he wouldn't drive on Shabbos. But in this case, he was presented with something that he felt. So here is a person who's facing, who would call himself, or who does call himself Orthodox, who wears a kippah, who would not be Machal Shabbos just for no good reason, but feels that he had two competing obligations here. He had his obligation as a Jew, as a religious Jew, to keep Shabbos, and he had his obligation as an officer in the army to be Machal Shabbos, and he in the end decides to go with his obligation. So to me, that's a very good example. Maybe it's an extreme example, but of course examples are always extreme. That's why they're good for helpful as examples of shituf. Of you have two sources of values, and they're independent of each other. And because they're independent, they can compete sometimes. But even if they don't compete, even on a day when they're not competing, the very fact that they're independent of each other means that you are not a nominal, you're not a what I would call radical or ultra orthodox, or ultra monotheist. Now, if you asked him, I'm sure, how many sources does the creation of the world have, he would definitely say one. And if you would say, how do you know? He would say, whatever. Okay, some pasuk along those lines, and he would be correct, but it would be inadequate. In other words, it's true, but not adequate to be a true monotheist.
So I guess my one pushback on this thesis as a whole is that again, you said it's an extreme example. Agreed. But wouldn't, the average student at Yeshiva University, agree with this as well, and yet self-identify not as Charedi? Meaning, is this all encompassing enough of a definition to include or to exclude those who would not consider themselves Charedi, right? And yet maybe you would call them Charedi, perhaps.
No. So a person who would say at Yeshiva University, let's just say, because you chose that example.
Okay,
but we'll go with it. We'll go with it. Okay, a person at Yeshiva University who says, I cannot have two sources of values. My values only come from one source. How I derive them from that source could be Shor b'machlekes. Like I said, that won't surprise me. There's been machlekes how to derive values from the Torah from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, right? From the time that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, and they forgot 300 halachas, and they started having to darshan the Torah. Immediately, that opened up the possibility of different ways of darshaning the Torah, and therefore machlekes. And nobody who knows anything about Judaism will be surprised to hear that there can be more than one way to interpret the Torah. But so if a person says, I have no source of values except for the Torah, and anything that actually feels important to me, or anything that I consider to be on my rashima of values, has to be an expression of God's will. Otherwise, it's not legitimate. Then he's Charedi as far as I'm concerned. The fact that he happens to, go to davening in open-toed sandals or whatever does not disturb me at all. Because again, that's why I think he doesn't have some of the cultural spin-offs of Chareidism, but he has the ideology of Chareidism.
Right. So the question is, doesn't that then render the label almost as inconsequential, because he's going to completely disagree with you about Zionism, about, the requirement, you're an exception, the requirement to be in the army or secular education or, all these other topics. But he has this one overarching idea or underlying ideological, consonance.
No, that's not actually that's actually not what happens. What ends up happening is that you get Talmidei Chachamim at Yeshiva University, let's say, like Professor Shachta. I don't like to use names, but this way I'll give an example. Okay, that has a certain ideology. There's a reason why he's a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University and not a Rosh Yeshiva in the Mir. Right? He's a Talmud Chacham. He could have been a Rosh Yeshiva in the Mir. The reason he's in Rosh Yeshiva is because he has a certain ideological affinity with Yeshiva University. Right? But if you came from Mars and you looked at him, you would peg him as Charedi. Not only if you looked at him, more importantly, if you spoke to him, you would peg him as Charedi. So even though there are certainly things about secular education that he considers to be valuable, whereas let's say if he spoke to Rosh Hashiva in the Mir, he would not value them. But he and the Rosh Hashiva in the Mir both agree that the Rambam would have valued them. And the only difference between them is that the Rosh Hashiva in the Mir would say that the Rambam lived in a time when valuing them did not create an independent source of value. And we live in a time where valuing them would create an independent source of value. So we have to reject it because of our monotheism, whereas the Rambam didn't. And Rav Shachta would maybe disagree on that Nakuda, whether or not it created. But he would agree that if it did create an independent source of values, that we would have to reject it. So he's just arguing in the Metzias, but he's not arguing in the fundamental value. So as far as I'm concerned, he's Charedi. He's Charedi. He has a different take on the Metzias. That's fine. Like I said, it doesn't shock me to find out that people will disagree about things in Judaism.
So why call that Charedi? Why not just call that a Torah observant or whatever?
Because the people who created what we today call Charedi, that's the idea that they were trying to promote. When Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch created Torah Derech Eretz, the idea that he was trying to promote is that all of Derech Eretz is subservient to Torah. And when the Rosh Hashivas in his generation in Eastern Europe rejected Torah Derech Eretz, the idea that they were trying to promote is that if we accept Derech Eretz in our generation, as opposed to in the generations of people who came before us, but in our generation, it will create a reality where all of Derech Eretz will not be subservient to Torah. So it's a machlekes in the Metzias, but they both agree with what the ideal is. They both agree what we're trying to accomplish. They have different ideas about how we ought to accomplish it. What I'm saying is that the Chareidism is the movement to try to accomplish that goal. If someone disagrees with the particular technique for accomplishing that goal, that's a machlekes within Chareidism. He's not Charedi, he just has a different take on how best to accomplish the goal. Versus somebody who's not Charedi is somebody who says that there's another source of values. I am a Sabbath-observing Jew, but I'm also an officer in the Israeli army. And these are two independent sources of obligation. Going back to the example that I gave. That's who's not Charedi. Now, if you have the same thing that happened, this just happened in Yeshiva University, where certain people that adhere to a certain type of deviance were using the legal system to try to force the university to express things that the university didn't want to express. And there was a big fight within the university itself between those primarily from Reeds, including many of the Rosh Yeshiva, Ramim, etc., that said, no, we can't have two sources of values. In other words, just because the modern world has decided to value a particular thing doesn't in any way obligate us, versus those who within Yeshiva University who said, no, it does obligate us. We want to be Torah observant Jews, so we'll keep Shabbos and we'll put on tefillin, but we also have to accept respecting certain deviancy because that's the values of the modern world, and that has authority in its own right. And that would be the division, let's say, within Yeshiva University, between those who I would call the Charedim that happen to be in Yeshiva University versus the non-Charedim.
It's a fascinating thesis. And again, I ultimately think that you end up drawing the line of Charedism far to the left of where the average person, at least in the vernacular, would draw it, which you may be okay with. But I do think that is the consequence
I'm okay with that, yes.
of this ideological position.
I would say it's not a random thing, though. It's not that I'm trying to redefine Chareidism. I'm trying to point out, and that's why in the introduction I said, if you want to have a precise scientific definition of Chareidism, you have to use a definition that would include groups that are culturally very, very different than each other, that even in terms of their practice are very, very different than each other. And if you draw the line at, let's say, people who are Zionists versus non-Zionists, it doesn't work, because then you cut out Chardalnim. You don't only call it Chardalnim, you cut out the Sadigur Rebbe. And I don't think that that's fair to the Sadigur Rebbe to cut him out of Chareidism. I don't think he would think that that's fair. Okay, so I think that if an honest appraisal of what the ideas that stand behind it would draw the line wherever the line is drawn, and if it turns out to be to the left of where simply using cultural terminology would draw it, then that's fine. It's a much better line. It's a much more scientifically accurate line.
Dr. Yechiel Reit, this is a fascinating conversation. We can go on for many hours. Alas, many hours we do not have at this moment. But the interested reader is encouraged to both not only look at the book, but buy the book. It's available on Amazon. We'll link the show notes, that link as well. And really encourage people to check that out and to formulate their own thoughts about this fascinating topic. Dr. Yechiel Reit, thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to put these ideas out there, because I think that that's kind of an important thing.